The Sound of Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
This week I'm speaking with Lauren Passell from Tink Media. Lauren is one of the sharper podcasting minds, and her experience in public relations gives her a unique perspective. Because let's face it, every podcaster is thinking about marketing, promotion, networking, social media, all in the name of growing your audience. Lauren also has two awesome newsletters you can connect with. One is called Podcast Marketing Magic, and the other is Podcast the Newsletter. Both are on Substack. Last April, she created the Adopt a Listener podcast initiative along with Arielle Nissenblatt to recruit more people to connect with podcasts. As she'll tell us, the results were interesting to say the least. One thing about this episode, the more we talked about podcast marketing, the more therapeutic it felt. It's as if I was in a podcast therapy session. Lauren's going to be at Podcast Movement later this month. Her session is called Podcast Marketing Maintenance. It will be on Tuesday, August 22nd at 11:15 a.m. Now, Lauren Passell joins me from New York City. Lauren, what was your first exciting experience with audio?
I guess music. My parents were big music people. This was like in the early 90s. My dad had a 300 CD, two machines. One you could put 300 CDs in them, and one you could put 200 CDs in them. And he somehow figured out how to connect them so you could shuffle between all 500 CDs. And so we would have it on in our house 100% of the time. Music, I think, was first, but I also remember I had one of those like little Fisher Price, like little kid boom boxes that would read me stories, all the Disney stories. And I feel like that was like the first podcast that I listened to. It would have like a chime and you would turn the page. Then I really fell in love with podcasts when I was on crutches in New York City and I needed something to listen to while I was, walking around. So that's my history with audio, I guess.
You started Tink Media back in 2018. Why'd you start it?
I couldn't get a job. I had, worked in book publishing for a long time, and I left there to go work in podcasting, and I got fired. I was in a really hard place, like the hardest place I've ever been. Back in the book publishing, I had always loved podcasts. I wasn't in PR or marketing, but the PR team would always come up to me and say, can you get some of our authors on podcasts? Like, can you get David Sedaris on some podcasts? I was always like happy to do it because I was like, this is what I dream about. I love this. I'll never forget the first time I emailed Anna Sale and pitching David Sedaris, and she responded to me. She's like a major celebrity. Like, I couldn't even believe it, and I was like, oh, I can do this. This is real. So I was doing that at the book publishing house. I left there, went to go work for a podcast company, got fired, and thought, I think PR people aren't great at pitching to podcasts. So originally it was just getting authors on podcasts to promote their books. But the more and more I started talking to podcasters, they were like, we need help with this too. Can you do this for me? So the whole company has just evolved from people asking me if I can do something and trying to figure out how to do it.
I mean, you clearly saw that podcasters were struggling with their marketing.
Yeah. Basically, I think a lot has changed, but when I started, I feel like it was very normal for people not to have a single thought in marketing, not have put a single thought into marketing. Sometimes coming to us after they launched and put out the entire show, I'm starting to notice that people come to me earlier and earlier, which is a really good sign.
So what's one of the biggest mistakes you see that most podcasters make when it comes to marketing their podcast? What's the one thing that you can look at and go, yep, I see that every day?
Spending money on social media.
Oh, yeah.
Or just, there's so many things tied to social media. Social media doesn't grow podcasts. It's great for the audience you have. So if I could do one solid thing, I would say take most of the time you're spending on social media and put it towards figuring out how to work with people, other podcasters. Partnerships is what works. I do a lot of consulting, and I say, if this meeting was 5 minutes long, I would say, set up a promo swap on every single one of your episodes. Goodbye. And keep on doing it, and you'll grow. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of things I cannot promise, but I am 99% sure you will see good organic growth if you set up a promo swap on every single episode.
promo swaps, it sounds just so simple and rudimentary, but yet you did a whole hour at Podcast Movement about promo swaps and how valuable they are. And I think a lot of people are like, they wonder what they are or how they should be doing them. So let's roll it back just a touch and say, what are promo swaps?
I could talk about this forever. Thank you very much. A promo swap, if you listen to podcasts, I know you've heard them all the time. It's when you hear a podcaster say, hey, if you like this show, you're going to like this other show. First of all, the reason social media doesn't always work is because you're targeting a lot of non-podcast listeners. It's very hard to turn a non-podcast listener into a podcast listener. I try all the time. So it's better go for the low-hanging fruit. Find the people that are already listening. And when you're targeting people who are listening to a podcast, you've found a podcast listener. And another reason social media marketing doesn't work is because people don't like to click off social media in general. But these promo swaps, you're targeting people listening. They're already there. They have their devices. So this is why they work. And also, it's a recommendation from someone they trust. You know, if I'm listening to your podcast, I trust you. I'm here. I'm invested in what you have to say. So if you tell me to listen to something, I'm going to listen to it. That is why they work so well. And if you want to set one up, I mean, basically, when I get a client and I want to set up some promo swaps, I pour myself a glass of wine. I sit back and relax. I open up a spreadsheet and I make a list of, this is going to sound cheesy, my clients' potential podcast friends. I think of these as friendships. That's overlap audience. And there's a lot of ways to figure out who your overlap audience is with, but it's podcasts where your audience is. The goal is to borrow audiences from each other when you're working together in these promo swap situations. So find those podcasts, email them, swap some copy maybe so that you can each do a host-read ad on each other's shows. I think host-read works more, but sometimes people switch digital files. Usually they're 30 seconds. Sometimes they're dynamically inserted. Sometimes they're not. It doesn't matter. I think you can get really, really creative. I feel like I love it when people break the rules about when it comes to promo swaps.
Yeah, so that's a good recommendation that I learned last year, and that's have the host read the copy for the other podcast. So it essentially becomes a host-read ad for another podcast to encourage them to listen to it. And normally I'm into just swapping. Hey, you send me your promo, I'll send you my promo, which, yes, it's the lazier way, but you made a really good point that it's just more effective to have the host read the ad.
Yeah, and if you want, send them bullet points because they'll read it in their own words. And, you know, if you're doing multiples, you don't want them all to sound the same. And then when you send those bullet points, maybe pick out an episode of your podcast that you know that other audience specifically will like so that you make it a little bit more specific for those people.
I sometimes see podcasters with the opportunity to use dynamic audio insertion, and they haven't even considered the show promo, like that promo swap. It's kind of like a marketing opportunity that's in plain sight. I'm going to share my favorite tip for finding other people to do promo swaps, and that's using a website called Rephonic, and I'll put that in the show notes. But what's something that you would recommend for people to connect with other podcasters of a similar genre in order to do a promo swap?
Well, I feel like I should get rephonic.com/graph tattooed on my arm because I talk about it so much. I love that chart. It's such a good resource. I'm so glad you are telling people to use it. One of the first things I do is search for the show or a comp in Apple Podcasts and scroll to the bottom and it says you might also like. That's one way. You can do that in other apps as well. So I use Listen Notes. You know, sites like Listen Notes and Podchaser all offer lists of similar shows when you search. This is how I start going down rabbit holes. I make this big list of my podcast friends. I'm going on Rephonic. I'm going on Listen Notes. I'm going on Podchaser. I use Player FM. I will type in something very specific, like best tomato gardening podcasts, Player FM. I will Google that. They have very specific lists in there. And the thing I like about Player FM is they will tell you when the last episode was published right up front on the page. So you can know if you should be wasting your time with it. If it hasn't had an episode in 5 years, you'll know right away. The other thing is, you know, I want people to do these promo swaps together so much. I built a database on my website. Actually, Anne of my team built the database. I cannot take credit for it. But anyway, if you go in, you can put in your show. Everyone should do it. Add a few tags, a little bit of information about the size. And search for shows that are similar to yours and then email them and talk about doing a cross promo. What's good about this is sometimes when I email someone about a promo swap, I say, would you like to do a promo swap with me? And they say, that's interesting. Shall we Zoom about it? And I'm like, aha, you have no idea what a promo swap is. Then I end up doing this whole lesson about promo swaps. The people in the database on tinkmedia.co all know what one is. They've opted in already. You just email them. They're down. So you don't have to explain anything.
I want to talk a little bit about writing ad copy because you've written it for your work. I've written it through radio. I've written a lot of promos, but you gave a great suggestion about writing up bullet points for somebody else to read about your show. But what about when it comes to writing for your own show? Let's say you had to write a mid-roll ad for a client. Let's say you had to write an ad about your show. What are some tips that you can do to really, make it so that it doesn't become wordy or compact, or because a lot of people don't have any experience with this. And the next thing you know, they've written 2 minutes and they needed to really write 45 seconds.
I know. And it's so important because think about how much time you put into your podcast. And then the copy on those things are so important. They're like life or death in some cases. I'm not so much of a podcaster as a podcast listener. I will tell you, I hear the same wording 100 times a day. The same wording on multiple episodes. Give me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to, I get 100 asks in the same phrased the same way. My biggest suggestion is to make your copy stand out. Say it how you really mean it. Don't say, give me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I hear that so many times. I know that you should be doing this, but just think of another way to say it. Explain why you want them to, why it's important to you. Be honest and vulnerable and maybe read some of the ratings and reviews. Also, I'm doing something this year where I leave a Apple Podcast rating and review for a podcast every day of the year. And I kind say sometimes I even really love a show and I don't know what to say because I don't have tons of time. I don't want to spend forever. Tell people what to say. I don't mean literally tell them, but give them a suggestion of something to say. Even if it's just tell me where you're listening from, something to get them engaged. They'll leave their rating and a review. If you maybe help them out a little bit, maybe like ask me a question or think about it based on your show, but you know your audience, so you can think of something.
Are ratings and reviews important?
I think they're really important because as my friend and partner, Arielle Nissenblatt always says, when you go to a podcast and you see that there are ratings and reviews there, it's like someone was writing, I was here on the bathroom wall. It's great social proof. But, Apple Podcasts, it says on their website, it doesn't help in the algorithms. That's another tip I would give actually about the copy. I cringe when I hear podcasters say, give us a rating and review. It helps us in the algorithm, because it doesn't help you in the algorithm. What helps you in the algorithm is getting a lot of downloads and having a great show and all those things. But it's still really important. Sometimes I will go to a podcast and if I see that there's no ratings and reviews or one or two, I think, didn't you even at least ask your family or your friends to leave a review? People are spending not a lot of time sometimes looking. If there's nothing there, they might not feel like it's a good enough show to even test out.
Do you think podcasters outsource too much, whether it comes to maybe finding a guest for the show or making appearances on social media, like writing show notes, for instance, and like using AI instead of, doing it yourself? Are we at a point now where we're outsourcing ourselves just a little too much to the point where the marketing doesn't feel personable?
I don't think so. I think that people should use all the help they can get, and they need all the help they can get, especially podcasters wear 10 hats, and a lot of them want to spend time on their audio, which is what they're good at and what they should be doing. And it's funny because sometimes when I tell people that, for example, I'm tweeting about your podcast isn't going to grow it, I get two different reactions. I get people saying, that's not true. My tweets get a lot of likes. And I'm like, that means you have a lot of friends. That's very nice. But sometimes people say, oh, I'm so relieved. And to me, that says, oh, they want to focus on the audio. They don't want to do the marketing part. That's not the part of their brain. That's not the part that lights them up. It's impossible to be good at everything. And I think if you can even just get a little bit of help, it's good, but you have to find the right people and you have to have good judgment and you have to have the final say. And in the end, it's up to you.
So if I'm just posting on social media about the podcast and I do, let's say, a Facebook post, a LinkedIn post, 3 tweets a day, and I'll even throw it up on Threads now because I feel I have to, I don't think I've done my marketing for the day, or have I?
No, you haven't. But that's good. Do that. because it's a good reminder. I wouldn't say don't do it, but don't expect anything out of it. So before I was saying, if I could steal some of your time away from the social media, I would say make it a goal to find 5 podcast friends a week or something like that and email them, or subscribe to a new podcast newsletter, or pitch yourself as a guest to one show a week. Like find that show and pitch yourself, something like that. Those partnerships really work and they take more time. A pitch letter should take at least 15 minutes to write. So it's a lot up front, but it's really worth it and it works.
Newsletters work, but newsletters are, I mean, you've got 2 of them, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And they are a labor of love. Not everybody is good at them. I don't consider myself to be very good at it. I like reading them. I see good ones out there. So what's the difference between a really good newsletter and just an average newsletter?
Well, if you have a podcast, I think an average newsletter is just going to say, hey, we have an episode out. And that's fine, but not the best use of the space. I think that the best kind of podcast newsletter could be enjoyed if you don't even listen to the podcast. It's its own thing. It has maybe show notes or extra information about the podcast, but ideally they drive people to the other. So you're getting people to read it and really want to listen to the podcast, but they don't have to, and vice versa. I love it when people have behind the scenes things in newsletters. I love it when people have recommendations. When podcasters give recommendations, obviously for podcasts, but also other things too. I think it's a great way for you to get to know the podcaster a little bit better and also pull in people from your community, shout out other people, other podcast makers, other artists and creatives. There's so much fun stuff you can do in a newsletter. I think it's always kind of a bummer. I'm always glad when someone has one. I always tell people the second you start your podcast or even before, you should start a newsletter. And they're like, I don't have content yet. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Those email addresses, you don't own your Apple Podcasts audience. Start collecting those email addresses and save it. Then when you do have content, you'll be ready to send out your content to people. So I'm always excited when someone has one, but it's a little bit of a bummer when I get the newsletter and it's just, hey, we have a new episode out. I want more.
Transcription of the Sound Off podcast is powered by the Podcast Super Friends, 5 podcast producers who get together to discuss podcasting. Sharpen your podcast and creation skills by following the show on the Sound Off Podcast YouTube or Facebook page. The Sound Off Podcast supports Podcasting 2.0, so feel free to send us a boost if you're listening on a newer podcast app. If you don't have a newer podcast app, you can get one at newpodcastapps.com.
Is the best marketing still word of mouth?
Yes.
Podcast recommendations, it feels like a whole industry unto its own. I mean, I think when I ask people, what do you listen to? They go, I listen to Smartless, I listen to The Moth, and then they're going to list off 10 other podcasts I've never heard of before. I feel like that's every conversation I have about podcasting.
I love that. I hope you're writing them down. You should send them to me, the recommendations you're getting. What are you listening to right now?
I'm starting Scamanda. I do listen to Repurposed Radio later. So I'll listen to a sports show at the end of the day. I'll do that for 8 months of the year when the NFL football season is in play. And then it doesn't get very exciting because I listen to a lot of podcasts about podcasts.
I love this. Those are my favorites.
So New Media Show, Podcast Weekly Review, Dave Jackson's podcasts. I'll listen to those. And the feed, Libsyn's the feed. I'll just listen to those. Yeah, it's not exciting stuff, but it's the stuff I like to listen to. Should my podcast be on YouTube?
I mean, it depends. I talk to a lot of podcasters who say, wait a second, I got into this podcast thing because I didn't want to be on video and I don't want to do my hair. It can be a big investment. If it's really going to bring you down, I wouldn't do it. If it's really going to bum you out to do it, I wouldn't do it. But I think there's some pretty easy things you could do. YouTube is the biggest search engine. So thinking of ways to splice up your content and think of ways that people might be searching for that content using questions and lists, like how to put your podcast onto YouTube. Here's a clip. So, if you could make a few video clips that drive people back to the podcast, I think that it's worth it. But right now we still don't, I think, have enough information about what is available to us on YouTube and how it benefits podcasters. And also, I'm an audio person. I'm always going to say cherish your audio first, but who knows? I'm sure that answer will change soon.
So I either did something really brilliant today or I made a big mistake. And that's, I let it leak to a few people that I would be talking to you today.
Uh-oh.
Oh, can you ask her some questions for me?
Oh.
And they are asking me things that might sail over my head.
Okay. Maybe mine.
I hang out with podcast people and now they're asking podcast questions that are, sailing sideways on me. Does Lauren agree with the concept of low conversion levels that come from podcast clip marketing, TikTok funnel to Apple, Spotify?
I believe in all kinds, anything that will drive people. And I don't know what low level means. I think that we put so much emphasis on a download, but download isn't the only goal you should have as a podcaster. So I don't know. Is your goal to also get more TikTok followers? Is your goal to reach TikTokers and people that are on TikTok? Is your goal to reach Gen Z people? I kind of think everybody first, step back a couple steps and say, what is my goal? In fact, I ask podcasters that a lot and they're like, no one's ever asked me that before. And I'm like, wow, let's think about that first. Because one of my clients was someone with a business and their goal wasn't actually to have tons and tons of downloads. They just wanted to get a few new clients a month. That was really important to them and it made a big difference to them. So that was their goal. So really think your goal doesn't have to be getting 10,000 downloads an episode.
Can you get the same SEO results and views from putting your audio on YouTube as opposed to doing straight video? I
don't think so. But I think that's what is so great about YouTube. That's where you could make the most out of your SEO.
So 42% of Americans listen to a podcast in the last month. That's the number we're given from Edison Research. Last April, you and Arielle Nissenblatt got together for Adopt a Listener Month. How many listeners were adopted? And did the program work?
The program worked, but not how I thought it was going to work.
Really?
Yeah. We went out and spent an entire day in Washington Square Park. And I thought it was going to be me giving people podcast recommendations. Oh my gosh, you love Ohio? Here's a podcast all about Buckeyes just for you. That's not what happened. It was more of a podcast awareness campaign. People needed to hear the word podcast for the third time of their lives and be reminded that that was there. One woman thought we were lying to her that podcasts exist. I had to show them on her phone. I'm in a bubble. My understanding of how many people listen was really far off. I don't know how many people were converted technically. I thought it would be more of people coming to me and saying, my aunt did not listen and now she listens every single day. That was my hope. Okay. But what ended up happening was I got people talking about sharing the idea of podcasts as an awareness campaign, like the Got Milk campaign. And what I hope for is that next April, more people join me and it turns into more of a reminder of what we have here, what they are, and get it into more people's brains.
And that's a great lesson really for podcasters and people in radio or any form of media, and that you can't read the label inside the pickle jar. You've got to get out of the pickle jar and go out and meet people and find out that they really don't know much about the whole thing. And I think he probably used my favorite tactic, which is when somebody says, oh, I don't know anything about podcasts. I don't know where to find them. And then it's, give me your phone. And then you go to this purple thing. This is your purple app. You will always use the purple app for podcasts. And then people can go in and go, oh, I didn't even know that this existed. Then comes the next hump, I think, which is really where podcast recommendations come in. And I think it's a problem with Netflix. Let's watch Netflix. It takes 7 minutes to find something to watch. What can we do when we search out a podcast to listen to? What can we do to make sure that we find what we want to find in a minute or two and we don't get into that Netflix trap of just the endless scroll looking for something to listen to?
If you only have a minute, first let me say, this is another good thing about promo swaps. It's not just a good way to help podcasters grow. It's a good way to get podcast listeners the correct recommendations because you probably have set up a promo with someone like-minded. And so if I'm listening to the Daily Zeitgeist and I hear a promo for American Hysteria, that's a recommendation I should take. So I feel like listening to podcasts is the best way to get more curated recommendations. And that's through promo swaps.
So like I said at the beginning, Lauren is joining us from New York City, which can be noisy. I'm guessing what you're about to hear is a fire truck that goes by. And I'm telling this for the benefit of those listening in the car that the siren is on the podcast and not in your immediate vicinity. You see, Lauren was on a roll, so I made an executive decision to leave her on a roll. I knew you'd understand.
So take note. Don't let your brain skip over the promo swaps. Actually listen to what they're saying. And if you're a podcaster, listen to how they use their promo copy also as a side note. You know, if you only have a minute, I think that another good thing is the newsletters. Sign up for every single podcast newsletter. I mean, if you're a podcaster, you need to be subscribed to podcast newsletters. You absolutely must, so that you can pitch yourself, but also to know what's going on in the industry. And that's a lot of my go-to when I'm like running out, not that I'm ever going to run out, but if I'm like, I need something new, I need something that I don't already have in my library, I will go through my list of podcast newsletters.
What should podcasters do to adopt a listener? It's something we could and should be doing year round. I'm glad you brought it to fruition in April, but what can we be doing year round to recruit more people to podcasting to get that number from 42% perhaps to 50%?
To go back to my Ohio example, I'm from Ohio. So I thought it would be really like, oh my gosh, you are living in Ohio. You're going to love this podcast about Cedar Point Amusement Park. You're going to love it. Okay. That was what I thought. Cause I know so many podcasts. I love niche, weird podcasts. I can find a podcast for anybody. I was like, I'm going to nail this. Okay. I had a conversation with Tom Webster and he changed my mind about this. He said, Lauren, don't get too cute about it. And I knew what he meant and he was right. And what he meant was send them the best. Don't send them something specific if it's not the absolute best. So at Tink, we made a list of what we thought were some of the best storytelling, the ones that you're like, how could you not love This American Life? I'm sorry. Just, it's still good. Don't forget about This American Life. There's so many new shiny shows. Don't forget how good it still is. Send them something amazing to make them fall in love with audio. That is my biggest advice.
What can we do to get together to lower the number of microphones that appear in podcast artwork? It absolutely makes me nuts. I actually banned it from my company. I still have there's still a couple microphones kicking about, but the people I work with, I said, we are going to get rid of those.
I love that you said that. I almost brought that up earlier. I do something called podcast therapy, which is consulting. And I can't tell you how many times I start and say right off the top, we know it's a podcast. You don't need the microphone there. I have a question though, because I tell people this and sometimes people are like, well, I should have one because my podcast is about podcasting, or you know what I mean? They have some. Do you think there are any exceptions to this rule?
I'm going to say no. I still think you can do it without a microphone.
Have you ever seen it well done?
Artwork for a podcast about podcasting?
2 questions, I guess. Artwork for a podcast about podcasting, and have you ever seen it done well, someone using a microphone on artwork?
I'll give a shout out to Denver Wine Radio, which is a podcast that I work with that actually had the wine being poured into the microphone.
Ooh.
So I let that one slide. I think the feed is fine. I think there's no microphone in that, I don't believe. And I get what I need. They changed the cover of the artwork, put the episode number in. I think it's a fine use of artwork. Shows up nicely on Apple CarPlay. Effective. Listen, it's not the cover of Fleetwood Mac Rumors, but it gets the job done.
Artwork is important. I think, we judge books by covers. It's so important.
Okay, so let me ask you, what makes for good artwork? My advice to people is, can you recreate Fleetwood Mac Rumors? If you were going to release if your podcast was going to be a piece of vinyl and you would hold it up, what would it be like? And I say, don't do book covers, because book covers have writing all over it. You don't want writing all over your artwork. Can you make Dark Side of the Moon? Can it be Fleetwood Mac Rumors? Can it be the Boston debut album? What sort of artwork is out there?
I love thinking about this. I mean, I think basically, I rarely think someone's picture should be on a podcast. Most podcasts need a little bit of a descriptor or a subhead, I think, unless the title says it all. I don't think you always have to say with, and then the person's name. I also love it when people do things like the podcast, This Is Dating. I think they went out to like a painter or something like that, like finding non-traditional ways to get that art. I love it when people do that. So I love your idea of the album cover, because it is like, can you enjoy this on its own? Like, oh my God, most of the time for podcasts, no. But isn't it such a treat when you see one that you really love and that it's art on its own? I think we need to start thinking about that more, because I worked with a podcast called City of Ghosts, and we got it featured on Pocket Casts, which, isn't the biggest app. It's my favorite app, but the artwork was so beautiful. I'm positive it really did well in Pocket Casts. And I'm positive it's because the artwork is beautiful. Look it up, City of Ghosts. I can attribute downloads because the artwork was so good. So I really do think it's important.
And now that Apple Podcasts is starting to integrate it more into their apps, it's more important than ever. So much so that I hired a graphic designer. Had to. It just somehow just got just a touch beyond Canva for me.
How often do you think people should change their covers?
Whenever they want. I'm more concerned about changing the imaging at the beginning of the show audio-wise. If you have any. A lot of people don't. I still think you should have 15 seconds of audio branded right at the beginning of your show, just in case somebody puts your podcast on their website, so at least you get the credit for it. You just need 15 seconds. It's just sound design. Don't read the description. You've already sold the car to the listener. They're driving away with it, and you're still selling them the car. If you're reading the description back to them, just, this is the name of the show. Here we go. It's just it. And think sound design. Don't think audio and words.
That's very good advice, because I think a lot of podcasters forget that, like, I might be coming in cold and this might be the first episode I've ever listened to. I might not have read the description, so I do need information. I think they're so in it sometimes. They've listened to every episode. They've been there, obviously. So they forget how you need to get someone who might have been dropped into your world and have no idea where they are.
But you should be able to tell somebody about your podcast in 8 seconds. Title of the show, it's about this. Here we go. I don't think I need your LinkedIn biography to get to the beginning of the show.
No. You need to think about the listener.
You read 3 to 5 books a week?
Not anymore. How did you know that about me?
Internet.
I used to work in book publishing, and I did when I worked in book publishing. And I still try to read as much as I can now, but it's not 3 to 5 books a week anymore.
But I bet you it's 3 to 5 podcasts or more.
Oh, yes. I listen to probably 6 hours a day, possibly 5 to 6 hours a day. And usually it's a little sped up. So I'm more on the weekends. So lots of podcasts.
So that was going to be the very, very personal question. Is it 1.5x? Is it 2x? How sped up?
Sometimes, depending on the show, I'll go 2.7. I feel like if I'm at 1.7, it feels like my brain is warped. I think at 1.7, I feel like it's 1. But if I'm listening to a show that deserves my full attention, if I'm listening to Caitlin Prest or a music podcast or something, I will listen at 1.0. Also, my husband, we listen together, and I have to listen at 1 with him. So that's what you do when you love someone. You listen at 1 point speed with them. So I do listen at 1 sometimes. How's
your anxiety? Because I find that when you listen sped up, it creates anxiety.
I'm on Lexapro. It's all good.
You mentioned it, and I was actually going to title podcast episode this, but you've already mentioned it. And I felt like, ding.
Oh, I love that idea.
Do you feel like a podcast therapist?
I do, because a lot of times I am not a therapist, first of all, but in these therapy sessions, it is consulting, but it's so much more, because there's a lot of emotion. It's a lot of pouring out of your soul and vulnerability. And also, podcasters aren't always sure. They're not getting feedback sometimes. So I feel like the podcast therapy sessions, it's more than just, what should go on your cover. It's so much more. That would be a great honor if I could be considered a podcast therapist. Someone to listen. I'm listening. Someone, if I could be considered someone who's really listening and that you could trust to go to and listen, that would be a big honor.
Lauren, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I can't wait to listen to this episode.
Are you speaking of podcast movement?
Yes. Are you?
I am not.
You're going to be there?
I will definitely be there. It's my summer camp.
Me too.
I have to get out of Winnipeg. It's like all I do is I sit here and I got to get out of here. I can't be here anymore. I got to go hang with my people.
I'm so excited.
The Sound Off podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.